Hi there, I'm Nathan Hitchcock, and I'm really sorry that you're watching me by video and not having a mango smoothie in Florida. If you need permission, you can make a mango smoothie to watch this video. All right, strategies for assessing character. Thanks for joining me in this session. Again, my name is Nathan. I work with Seven Sided Consulting, and I drank the Kool-Aid years ago with competency-based education and have been helping seminaries and denominations and a handful of other organizations ever since. Doing what? Implementing competency-based training systems. And if you want to hear about my hobbies and stuff like that, I'll tell you some other time. It involves throwing stuff. Hey, we don't have time to cover everything in this session. Would love to cover theory of ethics and taxonomies and all this stuff. We're going to do just kind of some drive-bys there, but we are going to have time to hit a few things when it comes to measuring character, assessing character. The first objective is this: we'll understand the challenges associated with assessing character. It's hard. We'll find out why. Two, we'll identify verbs associated with competencies in the affective domain. That is, we'll really dial in on certain verbs that you can use in your competency statements. And I'll argue they're really important to getting to where you want to go with your assessments. If you get your verbs right, a lot of stuff will fall into place. And number three, we'll name an array of suitable outputs for assessing character. That is, we'll find some artifacts or some demonstrations that really are good when it comes to measuring character. Now, I have a few assumptions here as we go in. First of all, that character is paramount. There's a lot of good studies out there that are showing that character, however you define it, is really important for a whole lot of applications. More than just cognitive knowledge, more than just a kind of skill set. Your affections, your disposition, your character affects everything. And for that reason, it's important. I'm also assuming that character is measurable. I know sometimes people object to this because they say it's purely subjective, but it's just not true. And there's a biblical argument out there. You shall know them by their fruits. We don't have time to go into all that. I'm just assuming that character is measurable. And number three, I'm assuming that schools in general, and seminaries in particular, those who are raising up clergy, are in the business of forming and measuring character. This stuff matters to us. We dare to go there. Well, the first objective I have for this session is to understand the challenges associated with assessing character. And those challenges are myriad. In fact, in the live session, I'm going to be partnering people and we're going to come up with a long list of challenges. You might think of a few just off the bat. Character really is so internal, it's hard to measure. It's hard to measure with any one test. You need a bunch of them. You need to be around for a long period of time to really see character show up because it has to do with patterns. There's problems with taxonomies and the theories that go into this, philosophical theories, religious commitments. All these things make character really challenging. But let me focus in a little bit more about why character could be so challenging. I'm going to throw out a definition. This is not perfect. This is not the only definition out there, obviously, but it gets the conversation going. I'm going to say that character concerns personal qualities played out through behaviors in relationships over a period of time. Again, character concerns personal qualities played out through behaviors in relationships over a period of time. And regardless of which part of character you prefer or how you come at it, hopefully this gets near your definition. Well, if you grant this definition, you'll notice some of the difficulties with assessing character, just given the definition. Character concerns personal qualities. They have more to do with the person, even the interior part of the person, the attitudes and dispositions and feelings and things like that. And those are hard to measure. And then they're played out through behaviors. So not simply a kind of clear performance, but habits, behaviors. And those behaviors are not just done in isolation, but they're done in relationships. John Dewey talks about how moral education has to do with educating a student for the society. It has this kind of societal telos. You're a citizen of whatever community. Well, that's kind of tricky to measure. And then it's over a period of time. We're not looking for one off instances. We're looking for some kind of repeatable pattern, which is going to require some time. And when you think about it, this is why character is so hard to measure traditionally. If you think about a typical semester, let's say 15 weeks, are you really going to be able to assess the character of your students in 15 weeks? Well, do you get to know them personally? Yeah, kind of. Some of them at least. But do you really get to know them personally? Behavioral. Are you really focusing on their behaviors? Well, you do see some behaviors. Are they turning in things late? Are they overly dependent on AI? Do they speak to people kindly or rudely? But even then, it's a limited data set. It's relational. You might have a relation with a student, maybe, but are you really paying attention to their relationship with other students? Maybe. But how about their relationship to their husband or wife, to their kids, to their neighborhood, to their church, their mentor, their pastor? How about those relationships? Well, you really don't have access to many of those. And then longitudinal, if character concerns something longer range, then you can realize you're not the best person to assess character because you're with them for 15 weeks. Now, I know sometimes you may have a major or you have somebody in your program for 3-4 years. Awesome. Then not always. And even then, you get a limited look at their character. So already we can see here that you have to do character assessment differently. And that would be my first key insight for you, to expect heart assessment, that is character assessment, to look different than head or hands. It's just not going to be the same thing as assessing whether they have a certain knowledge set, say recall or understanding or analysis. It's going to be different than doing a certain task. It's just bigger and more complex and harder because of that definition. All right, objective 2. I'm moving along pretty quickly for you. I hope you feel free to go back and look at this again. Likewise, feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from you. I'm at dr.nathanhitchcock@gmail.com, dr.nathanhitchcock@gmail.com. Objective number 2 is identify verbs associated with competencies in the affective domain. Let's see if we can figure out some verbs. So here's the deal. You're probably part of this session because you've had some trouble assessing competencies, I assume, assessing character competencies. Well, if you're having trouble assessing character, the problem is probably upstream with your competencies. I've gotten to work with a pretty wide array of groups now, and this is a commonality I found. When they hit trouble assessing character, it's usually because something has gone wrong at the competency level. It's just not clear enough. And you know this from CBE. Remember backward design or downward design or reverse engineering, whatever you want to call it? You start with the end in mind, and then you work backwards from there. So in this case, I think the main problem has to do with the verbs that we use. Let me give you an example. Consider this character competency. The learner is compassionate with the suffering. This is important for a range of jobs, right? Having compassion, being compassionate. But notice the verb is. It's to be. And to be is a tricky verb when it comes to any kind of assessment, but especially with character. Because what do you throw at that? Like what kind of assessments do you use? What sort of outputs do you look for? It could go all sorts of different directions. It's just not clear enough, even though it seems appropriate at face value. So what happens is this. We go, oh, well, is compassionate. We don't have all the analytical tools to kind of pick that apart here, but we do have a good impression of it. So you end up sounding like Potter Stewart, the judge who said regarding pornography, I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material, but I know it when I see it. Right? And don't we do the same thing as assessors? Well, I don't know what compassion with the suffering really is, but I know it when I see it. And there's a place for holistic assessment, for that kind of subjective assessment, but we can really rely on it too much when it comes to character. And we end up sounding like the I know it when I see it guy. So let's see if we can get some more verbs, a little more specific with our verbs when we describe our competencies. When we say, here are the characteristics we're looking for, the character characteristics, beyond saying is something, maybe we can use some other verbs. I'm going to tap into a few taxonomies here just to kind of broaden our minds. Here's one from Krathwohl. This is Bloom's student. In fact, I think Bloom had something to do with the affective domain taxonomy here. The details don't matter. I just want you to see that Krathwohl and company, they said when you speak about character, or the affective domain as they prefer to call it, there is a receiving that happens. Somebody can receive when it comes to the character development. They receive initial values, and then they respond to that, and then they begin to value it. They place value on a behavior, idea, person, situation. Eventually, they begin to organize it. They prioritize values. They resolve conflicts between them. And then at the highest level, and this is a level taxonomy, Krathwohl and company, they talk about internalizing values. This is the kind of integration. The value system is internalized and controls behavior. And you'll see some parallels to Bloom's cognitive taxonomy here. But just go ahead and look at the verbs here. So we start talking about receiving something, responding to something, valuing, organizing, internalizing. So let's go back to that compassion competency. So instead of saying the learner is compassionate, we say the learner responds compassionately to the suffering. Okay, responding to a person, a kind of person responding to ideas. So we're looking for something more behavioral there. So instead of a free-for-all where you could attach any kind of assessment to that, now your mind probably starts going to more tangible assessments. The learner responds compassionately to the suffering. How might we measure that? Or another example, the learner values compassion for the suffering. For Krathwohl and others, they would say value is actually a higher level thing. It's a higher, it's a higher level characteristic, meaning that you kind of pulled things together. This would be closer to the idea of phronesis for Aristotle, where you kind of wrap the idea around your behavior. Not that that matters all that much. I'm just trying to point out here that the verbs can matter. Let me give you some verbs that I've used in the past. I've worked with some clients and we've developed something that we found a little more helpful. At least we enumerated some verbs. And you'll find something similar to the whole kind of Bloom's taxonomy here. But here we go from sort of a lower level at top. Recognizes. You can recognize certain values or people. And that's where we use verbs like identifies, or acknowledges, or appreciates. Commits, that's another type of character that has to do with affirming something, professes, values. Character can also show up in the key or the level of practices. So this is the more behavioral thing, a habitual thing, exercises, applies, and performs. And as you think about these verbs, think about how they really are different. That for the recognizes level, that's something that can happen through book learning. It can happen through video learning. It can happen in the classroom. But for practices, it's going to get more and more out there on the field, if you will. Reflects is another aspect or level. That's when a learner evaluates, processes, internalizes. Any of these verbs could work for a certain competency, at least in context. And then harmonizes. This is the more integral part. So that would be synthesizes, actualizes, integrates. where you really have the full development of that virtue. Okay, so these are some verbs that I like to use. If you go ahead and reach out to me, I'm even willing to give you the full taxonomy. I have a sheet. That's a nice cheat sheet for building your own competencies. Not that it's perfect, but it can help. It can help with your design. So in this case, we might say the learner affirms the importance of compassion for the suffering. And that's just different than another possibility, which is the learner practices compassion for the suffering. Or maybe you want to tie them together. The learner affirms the importance of compassion and practices compassion for the suffering. But do you see how we're getting more specific with our competencies? And that kind of specificity allows you to identify the proper assessments. Use those verbs. It's like your mother told you, use your words. So here's the thing. I work with some CBTE schools, those who identify more with competency-based theological education. And some CBTE schools have what I think of as compound competencies. They're big. They're more like learning outcomes. They're composite. They have a lot of elements. Well, if you're one of those schools that has compound competencies, consider verb stacking that aligns with your paradigm. You can still use verbs, just stack them. To get at that, consider this. So Martin and Briggs, from their great book from 1986, or Gagne and company, they've actually done a few books on this that address this. So character can be broken up into different parts, and I sort of like this, the ABC model. Every characteristic that concerns character has an affective aspect. That is, it's a kind of feeling, some kind of internal disposition, and you have to measure that a certain way. It has a behavioral component, that is how you enact that, the habit. And then it also has a cognitive component, or a metacognitive, I would say, in that there's a kind of reflection on your own disposition and a reflection on your own action, which you have to make sense of. Again, the Aristotelian sense of phronesis. So the affective, the behavioral, and the cognitive, when those things come together. I mention this because especially when you're doing these kind of compound competencies, you may need to stack your verbs in a way that takes into account those three different aspects. So notice the learner feels compassion for the suffering. That matters, like your internal motives, your internal feelings, the affections, as Jonathan Edwards would talk about them. Those matter. But they should be paired with the behavioral the learner associates with the suffering. You shouldn't just care about the suffering in theory. You should actually be around them, willing to associate with them. And then the cognitive, the learner reflects upon suffering and their own response to suffering. So there is a kind of place for the mental here, where you think about suffering. Maybe you do some reading on it, some thinking about it. And then you even hold up a mirror to yourself and you go, what just happened to me when I was in the midst of suffering or somebody else's suffering? There's a great invention last century called CPE, clinical pastoral education. It's a great idea. You take seminarians and you put them in really difficult situations in hospitals or wherever, and then you have them make sense of those case studies. Well, there's a lot of reflection that happens in the midst of that. So we could keep talking about that, but the key insight is this: dial in on verbs in each competency, which will help identify the proper assessment. Again, if you get your competencies right with some really clear verbs, that'll take care of a lot downstream. All right, how about one more? See, I wish I could play a game with you guys. It's really hard to do that online, especially in a recording. I like to play games. Maybe we'll have one live. But we keep on moving here. Objective number 3, name an array of suitable demonstrations for assessing character. For those of you who just want to get right down to those kind of tangible ideas, well, here we go. Here are some examples. Most of these are real. Real clients, real people I've worked with, or real people I know of. And we'll see what they do, and you can glean some ideas. Here's one from the Alliance of Reformed Churches. So they talk about pastors observing the Sabbath and other rhythms of rest. That's a competency they want to see in their pastors, observes the Sabbath and other rhythms of rest. So what have we been talking about? Focus on the verb. Let the verb drive the output, the assessment. So in this case, it's observes. So we're looking for some kind of pattern. We're looking for some kind of behavior with the Sabbath, so a day off, and other rhythms of rest. That's not defined. But the output here, they say, is list the name, relationship, and contact information of a coworker or spouse. This person will be asked questions about your daily pauses, your Sabbath day, and your vacations. So the output then has to do with a reference. And here's why references work so well. It should be made clear. Because other people have access to data that you don't. They see the pattern. They see the longitudinal stuff. They see the behaviors, not just in the moment, but in moment after moment. And so I know for this one that the Alliance has been getting references usually from a spouse, and the spouse fills in on the truth. And you can take more than one reference if you want to sort of get a crosshatch. That's fair. I know that they've looked into taking selfies in different places. Like, you were just in Washington, prove it. Where's your selfie? Because it's behavioral, because it's observes, you can start getting some artifacts that have to do with that. But a reference is at the core of this one. Here's another one. This one comes from a missions organization, global missions organization. Subscribes to the statement of faith while expressing basically compatible theological views. Okay, and you may be saying, well, isn't that just sort of a box to check off? Well, not exactly. I mean, subscribing to a statement of faith, expressing compatible theological views, that takes some effort, but more importantly, it is demonstrated proficiency or demonstrated alignment. So there you go, subscribes. If you focus on that verb, it begets this output: sign the statement of faith. Additionally, express some of your basic theological convictions on the designated form. So yeah, when it comes to matters of doctrinal affirmation or ethical affirmation, this can matter. But again, it just depends on your competency itself. You might say this is sort of a thin character competency. Maybe. But that's what it calls for based on the verb. Here's another one. Addresses conflict with a spirit of calm, patience, and self-awareness. Whew. This is conflict. Well, that verb addresses seems to call for some kind of behavioral piece. There might be a kind of self-awareness piece as well. So an output, and by output I mean a demonstration or artifact, an assignment, if you will, in the tangible sense. So take the conflict resolution simulator by immersion. Achieve a passing score, then explain to your coach what emotions you experienced and how you process them. Now, I mentioned this one because I did this and it was hard. I was at a conference, and Immersion, which specializes in simulations, they have AI. Fascinating. They basically just throw you into the lion's den. They say, congratulations, you're a middle manager and you have a disgruntled employee. Here's the basic situation. Go for it. And I get dropped into this simulation where there I am looking at the disgruntled employee virtually, right? And then this AI is like, well, you said you wanted to see me about what? So I try to explain it on this limited knowledge that I have. And she immediately gets defensive. She, quote unquote, obviously it's a AI. And I laugh a little bit, just involuntarily. And she's like, do you think this is funny? Yikes. So there you go. I did not have a spirit of calm, patience, and self-awareness in that moment. Took everything I had to get out of that one. Well, you can do simulations, and maybe you're like, you know what, we don't do VR simulations. That's not our thing. Fine. But you can do case studies. You can do live simulations. I've done that with students. you'd be surprised how much character comes out. When you put a little bit of pressure on, you'd be surprised what comes out. Here's another competency: interacts positively with a variety of people from other backgrounds. I mean, that's pretty important for certain organizations, right? That might be a more longitudinal one that you have in seminary. And I don't know how you grade, quote unquote, that. You can figure that out. But the point here is look at the verb, interacts. That has to do with not just a skill, but a kind of character trait, a kind of sociality. So the output here is attend the intensive. And SIM had a week-long intensive where they met people from all over the country, indeed, um, people from all sorts of backgrounds. And these were the folks they were going to have to work with over the course of years. So why not see how you interact with such types? Well, interact with people during the week. You will be observed by staff who will evaluate your interaction with others. And then they had their own rubric for this. They had their own criteria. But the point is this, that you're being watched if you're a learner, and then that's okay. That seems appropriate given this competency, given this verb. Here's what I'm borrowing from Northwest Baptist Seminary. They have a program called Immerse. This is an older version. They've probably updated this. But I love that they took on humility. So important in the Christian tradition. And they're just saying, we want humble learners. Well, students develop a personal conviction that humility is the foundation of quality character. Students develop a biblical definition of humility and practice it in leadership as part of their obedience to Christ. Now, you'll notice right off the bat that this is not a simple competency. This is a compound competency. Northwest is one that has compound competencies. But even here, if you modify it slightly, you can see the verbs. Students affirm a personal conviction. They define a biblical definition of humility. And they practice it as obedience to Christ. Right? So you can see some verbs there that are brought together. And you build a portfolio in this case to demonstrate it. And Northwest has tried some different things with their learning units. And you can see here they have some Bible reading, some instruction. So that involves some reflections, some participation live. And that third one, and the list goes on, by the way, there's many more than this. They have a long duration project. So students identify an area in which they can serve in a role that's considered to be below their level and will participate in such a role for at least 1 year. Stuff like soup kitchen, collecting garbage, not looking for public recognition. I think that's really cool because it lines up with practicing it as obedience to Christ. That seems profoundly Christian to me, that you would have something like that that flows from the verb practice. You practice humility. Or this one, the Wesleyan Church has a heart for the lost and a desire to lead people toward Christ. Well, this one, has a heart, is broader, and I was going to use this in the live session to see what people came up with it for the output. Here's another one. Exhibits baseline levels of altruism. That is, you might be looking for somebody who's not a narcissist, or at least trying to bring about some awareness of their narcissism level, their altruism level. The output could be this: undergo testing with Sigma's 6-factor personality questionnaire and the narcissism personality inventory, each conducted by a licensed psychologist. I bring this up because psychometrics, professional psychometrics from a trained psychologist, can be appropriate given the competency. If you phrase the competency that way, then absolutely you could use somebody who is a professional psychologist to do professional psych evals. All right, how about this one? Practices the fasted life. This is actually riffing off of one that I actually saw. It has to do with fasting. That is not eating or refraining from some kind of pleasure or refraining from some kind of appetite. Well, the output could be this: given practices, choose 3 types of fasting, for example, food, telecommunication, entertainment, or speaking, to practice for a multi-day period. and so on and so forth, with some reflection there at the end. But the major here is you are willing to practice something and you have some experience. You have a habit that you've begun to develop. All right, plenty more examples out there, but let me just conclude with this. There are a lot of different possibilities when it comes to character, but you'll notice that some of these, they're not typical. They're not your typical paper. Agreement form, case study, counseling, interview, journal, log, so on and so forth. The insight here is get creative with assessment and assessors. You'll notice with these that we had some unusual assessments, but don't forget this. We also had to get creative with our assessors. We had more mentors and professionals involved, more people on the ground, even family members. They were part of this. For some of you who really are operating more tightly within a traditional classroom, think about how you might bring in other people, including students. Can you have students assessing other students? Can you match up a student's self assessment with other students' assessment of them or your assessment? Absolutely. Get creative with the assessments and the assessors, even multiple assessors. All right, that's all we have time for today. Again, character matters, and assessing it well, that matters. I look forward to hearing from you. Maybe you've come up with some new ideas about how you can better assess character. Let's share those ideas and get this right.